Welcome to the Paranormal Pendle podcast, coming to you from the heart of Pendle Witch Country in the northwest of England. My name is Craig Bryant, author, investigator and collector of stories. Join me as we take a journey into the paranormal, UFO sightings, cryptozoology and big cats. This is the Paranormal Pendle podcast. Welcome to episode 26 of Paranormal Pendle, broadcasting to the Paranormal UK radio network at paukradio.com. My guest on this episode is paranormal author Graeme Milne. Graeme, first of all, thanks very much for coming on and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. I always like to ask guests when they come on the podcast for the first time just to sort of tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what your interest in the paranormal is, when it all started and so on. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, I mean, really, I suppose it all started when I was a really young kid. I was hugely into reading ghost stories, mainly fictional ones. But I mean, as I got older, I started to go into factual stuff, and I was quite fascinated. Living in the north of Scotland, of course, we're in castle country, so I used to read a lot of stories about all these green ladies and various castles around the area, and I was quite fascinated by it. But I guess what happened was when I was 21, I actually had a paranormal experience, which kind of changed my life. While I was house sitting in Dunfermline, of all places, which, if you don't know, is just a little bit away from Edinburgh, probably about an hour's drive.
Yeah.
And I was actually house sitting for my girlfriend's family. I mean, I didn't know I was going to be house sitting. I actually arrived to see her at a hotel in Edinburgh where she was staying with her family. Her father didn't know about my arrival, and he said he's not paying for me to stay there with his daughter. So he shipped me off to this empty house with a sleeping bag, and that's where I spent the night. The night, and I often talk about the story, you know, when I'm doing ghost tours, and most folk, I'm sure, don't believe me, but I was actually grabbed by the ankles in the middle of the night and pulled across the floor, resulting in my head getting smacked off the wooden floor. And of course, I woke up terrified, probably about 4 feet from the wall, and I sort of lay there like a caterpillar for, you know, probably about an hour, before I plucked up the nerve to get to the light switch. And I spent, the rest of the night awake, of course, in a panic, and from then on in, I thought, wow, there's got to be something in this. And that kind of really got me interested in the whole idea of, the afterlife, really. And from then on, my interest grew until as an adult, a much older adult, I started to write about ghost stories myself and take part in investigations.
Okay. That must have been quite a frightening experience then. I mean, how old were you, if you don't mind?
Well, I was 21, but yeah, it was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like it.
Yeah.
And it did. It was, I kind of laugh about it now, but I'm sure at the time I must have been absolutely petrified.
I'm sure. I mean, did you have any idea what it was? Was there any history in the place that you knew about, or you found out about later?
Yeah, the only thing I found out was it used to be an old manse that belonged to a minister of the Church of Scotland. Okay. But that's all I knew. It was semi-derelict at the time. And I was with my girlfriend at the time just for a matter of months after that, and the house was being done up. So I guess now it's completely different. But back then it looked fairly antiquated. The floors were all parquet flooring, big oak staircase. Quite a grand building, really. But I've never been back, so I'm not really sure what it would look like now, but it did belong to the Church of Scotland.
Right. So how did that affect you going forward then? Was it something that really sort of piqued your interest then in the paranormal from that point onwards, or was it later in life when you started getting more interested in it?
Well, it was one of these weird things. It was kind of always in the back of my mind, and I continued to read books. But as I got older, I sort of started to look at things and really think about, the possibility of an afterlife and energy continuing. Read a lot on the subject, and then started to look at the books that I've read before, reread them, and thought, wow, a lot of these stories you read about are kind of almost mythological. They're oft repeated tales. People talk about haunted castles, but very rarely can give you an exact, incident. It's just, yes, there's supposed to be a grey lady haunts here, and it's all very vague. And I kind of thought, I want to write a ghost book where I'm really that I would like myself, that I would get some real meat to. And I thought the best way about going about that was just to actually visit places in person, interview people, but also look at the history, because I always felt the history and the stories don't often marry. And I think it's really interesting to look at the history of a building, because if somebody turns around and says, yeah, there's a graveyard here or something, if your research shows it isn't there, then it casts a whole different light on these stories, makes you question them. And though I'm a believer, I still go in with a vaguely skeptical mind. I think it's important to keep a vaguely skeptical mind, at least.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I know. I agree 100%. So do you think then that a lot of ghost stories can be sort of built in the same way that legends and sort of almost hearsay and Chinese whispers, in effect? Have you found that can be the case more often than not, do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think so. Now, it's strange because Aberdeen and Edinburgh are two entirely different cities, as you can imagine. Aberdeen doesn't have much of a tourist industry, for example. So the ghost stories that I found out about really weren't things that were talked about. But there was a few, but a lot of things weren't mentioned or written about before. Whereas Edinburgh ghost stories, they're dyed in the wool and they're part of the fabric of the city because there's a whole industry built around it. And so these stories are often repeated. And what I found interesting was to go in and really look at these stories and look at the history and see if there was actually any basis for this, or were they just old wives' tales, essentially. And, I suppose picking them apart a little bit. And I found out some pretty interesting things, I think, that disproves certain things but proves other things, or potentially proves other things.
Okay.
But, Edinburgh really has a real love affair with ghosts, I would say, at least, in the public eye, I guess.
So let's talk about Aberdeen then. Because Aberdeen's a city, obviously, that I know of, but I don't know it as well as Edinburgh or indeed Glasgow. And I think probably most people who don't live up in that part of Scotland probably would say the same sort of thing. I mean, whereabouts are you based? Are you based up in the northeast of Scotland?
No, I moved to Edinburgh 4 years ago, but I had lived in Aberdeen pretty much most of my life up to that point. But we just fancied a move to Edinburgh. But I did live there, apart from the odd little escape now and then. And it's a great city. I mean, it's a city, like you say, that's not really in people's consciousness because it's not really known as a tourist destination. It's got some lovely parts to it. It looks great. It's very interesting. It's all made from grey granite, which is pretty unique.
Yeah, I was going to say it's called the Granite City, isn't it?
So when you come in, it's all very austere, beautiful buildings, sparkle in the sunlight. But of course, in the damp grey weather, which we get a lot, it looks looks pretty grim, But yeah, there's been a few stories associated with the area, but they tended to be around sort of castle country. And a lot of buildings within the city were an unknown quantity. There's a couple of authors before, had written about them in various books. And I kind of wanted to sort of carry on from that basis. There's a guy called Norman Adams, who was a journalist in Aberdeen, and he had a real interest in the supernatural and witchcraft. And he wrote a wee series of books in the 80s onwards, one about ghosts, one about body snatching, Crime and Punishment. Really good writer. And I just felt, wow, that kind of inspired me because he was really digging a little bit deeper, I thought. So he was the guy that got me going, I think, more than anyone else.
So what was the name of your first book then? Was it the Aberdeen's Haunted Heritage?
The first one was called The Haunted North. It came out 2008. And then the follow-up, Haunted North 2, 2012. And at the time, typically I was really quite pleased with them. But I guess looking back, as you get older and perhaps your technique improves, I was kind of a bit kind of embarrassed about it in some ways. I mean, I like the content, but I just think the presentation was a little off for my liking. Okay. So that was the whole reason to go back and revisit. So with Aberdeen's Haunted Heritage, which was the latest one.
Right.
It was kind of amalgamation of the two books, but I'd greatly expanded it because in the interim I'd gathered many more stories. So I kind of got rid of the superfluous stuff and focused on what I thought was potentially the most interesting stuff.
Okay.
But it is a reworking, if you like, but it's been added to.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right then. Let's get on to some stories then.
Sure.
Tell me some of the really good stories then from Aberdeen. Some of the really interesting ones.
There's a couple of good ones to kick off with. I mean, there's a great haunted pub called the Moorings, which is now called Krakatoa. And I remember at the time getting a phone call from the owner, and he says, "Oh, you've got to come in and check this place out. There's been numerous stories from staff witnessing things." So the phenomena ranged from things like poltergeist activity, for example, a bucket moving along the floor by itself, these kind of mists that would appear and then vanish very quickly, cutlery flying off the bar. There was a barman used to work there back in the 70s called Ted. He was a Canadian airman, ex-airman from the Second War, much older guy, of course. And he died in Aberdeen, but he was working there at the time as a cellarman. His spirit's been seen pushing a barrel by a couple of staff members in the basement towards the area where the beer would have been loaded down, but yet there was no sound coming from it. It was almost like a silent movie playing. Right. So there's all this phenomena, but the most scary things, I guess, was the guy who owned it. When you go to the cellar, it's very, very low. It's a 16th century coaching inn below. It's a very old basement. And there was a tiny room in the middle where he used to go and count up his pennies at the end of the night, where the safe was, essentially. And sitting on the wall was an ancient price list, from the 1970s. It was all like really 5p a pint, etc. And one day he decides to move it. Soon after, because of the phenomena, they set up some EVP in the basement, which he left overnight. And of course, they're looking or listening to it over the hours soon after. And it's all very quiet, nothing happens. And suddenly a male voice booms out of nowhere, "Put the price list back," like really full volume in his ear, which kind of freaked him out somewhat.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And one which I think was even scarier was, again, in the cellar. He's sitting in the safe room and he's on his own at night. Everything's locked up and something flutters down in front of his eyes. And when he looks in the table in front of him, there's a tiny black and white passport photo, the kind you'd get in the 70s. And it's a woman there, black and white photo. He flicks it over. It's got the name Anne on it, dated 1972. And he freaks out because a few days before that, one of his regular clients had vanished and the police had come in to find her. And she was a regular. She did have a drink problem, and that was her name. And this was an ancient photograph of her from 1972. And God knows how it had fallen between the floorboards, but it must have been stuck there for about 25, 30 years, and it just drifted down in front of his eyes. Wow. So the police duly arrived 2 days later to announce that they found out where she was. She died in hospital, cirrhosis of the liver. So that was quite scary. And of course, he bolted out of the pub and locked the door at that moment.
I'm not surprised. Yeah. That's quite a coincidence, isn't it? With the with the photograph. It's stories like that do make me more and more convinced that there are forces at work that we really don't understand, because I mean that would be just a real coincidence, wouldn't it, for it just to happen of its own accord. The voice as well is an interesting one, isn't it? Was that possibly the Canadian gentleman, or did he is there any sort of did he mention anything about whether there was an accent to the voice, or? Yeah,
they think it was a Scottish voice, and he thinks it's the previous owner was called Shep. Shepherd was the second name, but everybody referred to him as Shep. It used to be a biker's bar back in the day. And the price list comes from the time when he was the owner, and he thought it would have been him because of the accent.
Yeah. Interesting.
The basement floods as well, which was really odd. There's a kind of underground stream, if you like, that leads to the harbour below it. And of course, at high tide, occasionally, if there's been bad weather, the basement will flood. So it was a pretty strange area. There's a lot of water outside. Plus, bizarrely enough, in the old days, before the harbour front was actually extended, the water would have come right up to the point of where that building is now. And it used to be called the Potty. The Potty was a drowning pool for witches, excuse me, and child murderers. And there's 5 cases of people being drowned in the Potty historically in the late 1500s, literally outside the door of that building. So it's got a kind of dark history there as well, which potentially may have something to do with it. I don't know, but it's certainly an unpleasant thought.
Yeah, that's something that I've never heard of before. Actually, I've heard of obviously witches being ducked as a trial.
Yeah.
To see whether they sink or float.
Yeah.
But I've never heard of it being used as a method of dispatch, shall we say? Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, and any more then from Dean?
Well, you mentioned coincidence, and I do think that's right. There are certain things that are so strange, you've got to wonder if it's a coincidence. It must be one heck of a coincidence. But this is a great one. And this is probably one of the scariest ones, to be honest, for me. But I used to work for a place called the WEA, which was an education establishment. We looked after kind of people, women who'd left school early and wanted to gain, qualifications later in life. So basically, it was a tutor program, and it was in a very modern building, 1960s, attached to a creche. So I worked there for years as a tutor, and my partner was always saying to me, my manager was always saying to me, she thought this place was haunted. And it's true enough. When you went into the building, there was a really weird vibe about it at times, especially in the morning when you came in early. So one morning I came in the building, and as you go along this tiny corridor, there's 2 bathrooms on your left. And I walked by and glanced in, and there's a woman standing with her head in the sink, sort of washing her hair, long black hair. So I stepped back, and she'd gone. So, of course, I told my boss, and she was freaking out about this. And it got to a point, basically, where we had to call in a medium, because we did feel there was something odd. And the medium came in, and she said, first thing she said was, "Oh, yeah, I'm picking up the impression of a woman having her head shoved in the sink from the bathroom." And, of course, we told her nothing in advance. So that was very peculiar. But anyway, we did some research in the building and found out that on the site of it used to be an old Victorian plumbing shop. And I came in to see Annie with this information I'd found. This was the week before Christmas, 2007, I think. And the students were having their Christmas tea and cake before term ended. And I barged in and I said, "Oh, yeah, I found out this is a plumbing shop." And she made this kind of off-the-cuff remark, "Maybe we've got a phantom plumber." So that was all good. So we sat down. 2 minutes later, we could hear the sound of footsteps thundering up the stairs. The creche worker bursts in and says, "We've had a flood." Wow. So we ran through to the bathroom where the woman with the black hair had been seen. And this shower, which had never worked, and all the time we'd been there, had been switched on and was gushing water across the floor and had flooded the creche below. So It was like something had listened to us and said, "All right." And we couldn't switch it off. 2 of us were actually struggling to actually push this lever off. We eventually did, but whatever did it must have had some strength. Yeah. That was pretty scary, of course, and the students all legged out the door. They just ran for it. That was pretty odd.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's interesting, is that one, actually. I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I speak to, you've probably found this as well, when you speak to people about haunted buildings, they always tend to think of very old buildings being haunted. But I know of a case locally of a school which was only built about 15 years ago, that has got a lot of activity in it, a lot of poltergeist activity, and also a lot of what I would sort of class as recording type ghosts. So they just replay themselves all the time, but there's no sort of interaction. Yeah. But it's because of what was there before the school was built. It's not actually the school itself. It's the buildings and everything that was there before. And this sounds like a very similar set of circumstances, where you've got a very modern building, but of course, as you said, there was an old Victorian building there prior to that, and of course that's what's causing the manifestations. But that's some quite intriguing, I suppose you could call that poltergeist activity, really, couldn't you?
Yeah. And what was really odd was at the end of it all, because the medium came and did this blessing, we sat in the room, the bathroom. It was about 5 or 6. We sat in the bathroom where the all this incidents that occurred. It was a really horrible feeling there. So anyway, she did the blessing and we left and went through to the other room. All the batteries and the cameras and the recording equipment would be brought along. Now, I'm not a technical guy, but this guy Ross, who's really up into this, brought along all sorts of gear, and absolutely everything went flat as a pancake within literally 30 seconds. We got nothing. It just died. All the batteries and every single device went. And also, to cap it all, we'd left a glass of water, which the medium had taken into the bathroom to drink, had been left on the windowsill, and went to retrieve it at the end of the night. And it was way down to about an inch below, from the bottom. Something had actually drained the water.
Wow.
And it was just really, really strange. Nobody could explain it. And Ross, being a very sceptical guy, was kind of flabbergasted by this. He just couldn't understand it because, of course, he did everything worked out well in advance of the actual event. It was strange.
It's interesting you mention the electrical activity or the fact that the batteries were drained, because I've heard that happening quite a lot, where there's a breakdown of seemingly perfectly good working order cameras and recording equipment, and it's almost like it's some sort of electrical discharge that knocks these things out.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. I think my kind of perception, I suppose, is like you said before, there's recordings from the past that are not sentient, but you do obviously have sentient spirits which interact, and perhaps their energy so strong that they just affect things, like you say, like batteries and things and cameras.
Yeah,
it's quite interesting, and I think a lot of areas like bathrooms and kitchens peculiarly seem to be haunted, and I wonder if the water somehow is a conductor as well. They often say that a lot of hauntings occur on nights when it's raining, for example.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but it seems to point to that anyway. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And again, you mentioned there about water. I actually was a guest on a podcast earlier on this week, actually, on 2 days ago, and I was talking about water as well, because I'm now becoming more and more convinced that water does act as a conduit for energy that can cause paranormal activity or even any other sort of unexplained phenomena as well. And I've found that a lot of the research that I've done, where there's been particular sites of concentration of paranormal activity, there also does seem to be water involved. So that's really interesting you've said that. And you're actually the only other person that I've ever spoken to, or spoken to me as a guest, shall we say, that's actually brought that up. So I think that's really interesting. Yeah, so go on. I'm loving these stories. Have you got any more?
Yeah. One of my jobs there was working for the city council and working in the museums department, which was great because it allowed me to work over 4 different buildings, and 2 in particular very, very old. One's called the toll booth, which was a prison. Of course, toll booths are fairly common across Scotland anyway for collecting taxes and what have you. But this one dated from about 1641, and we used to go in there and do classes and take groups in and what have you and look up and down. It's kind of weird. It featured in Most Haunted, but I mean the way it was filmed, it made it look like it was an incredibly huge building. It's literally a tower, if you like. But anyway, it's got a weird history, and of course, being a prison, there's been lots of death and destruction attached to it. But I do remember probably the most obvious thing was going up with a group one day. We had a talk on the top floor, which was called the condemned cell. It was probably one of the smallest there. It was the original brick floor, etc. And in the corner, they had a glass case with a blade from the Maiden. That was like the Halifax gibbet, the guillotine. So we had that there, and there was always a weird vibe about it. But anyway, we're listening to the guide talking, and there was about 8 of us in the room, and myself and the 4 other students were nearest the door. And thump, 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 bump comes these footsteps up the stairs, very, very loudly. We were expecting the attendant to walk in, but all that happened was the temperature dropped. I mean, very, very noticeably. It was a warm summer's day. We're all looking at each other nervously, and then the footsteps came into the room, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing. But yeah, it was clump, clump, clump into the room, icy cold. And after the talk, as soon as we got outside, the students, of course, were all babbling and going, "My God, did you hear that? Did you feel that?" He goes, "Yeah, absolutely." So collected lots of stories from there. But I had a friend called Mary, and she went along there with her husband and their neighbour's kid just to have a look around. And on the first floor, it's a kind of slightly bigger room. And she's standing there looking at one of the boards, and it's talking about, the Covenanters, I think, if I remember correctly. And husband's somewhere else. And she hears a coughing behind her, and she looks around. There's a tiny wee guy standing behind her. She described him as being, about 4.5 foot tall. He's wearing a pinstripe suit and a kind of fedora type hat, 1930s style. And he winks at her. And she just screams and bolts down the stairs and almost ran into the traffic and literally had to be grabbed at the last minute by an attendant. She had to sit down and got a glass of water. And when she explained what happened, he said, that guy's been seen before. But he's not like a obviously very, very old historic character. But the thing was that was strange was the whole building was used as a record office in the 1930s for the council. Used to store wine there because it was a great temperature for storing wine, among other things. And this chap, she said, was completely solid. He just winked and he vanished. Boom, puff of smoke like that. He was gone. But she screamed the place down. She said to me, "I'll never go back there," she said. So you've had sort of people in modern attire seen there, but also people in kind of late medieval attire as well. So you've had a real broad mix of different spirits and activities. Shadow figures, EVP, cold spots, people being touched in the ear, a few different things. It's quite an interesting building, but I suppose considering what it was used for, it's not like this activity is happening continually. It's very, very sporadic. Right. But I did enjoy working there, I have to say. It was a kind of little added bonus for me,
So when, what sort of date did that date back to? Have you any idea?
The building itself dates from, I think, 1641 when it was built. And it was a prison right up till, I think, sort of slightly late Victorian. Then it shut because they built what was called Craig Inches, which was a proper prison on the outskirts of the city. And so it just became a record office. And I think about 30 years ago, they decided to open it as a museum. But I mean, it was in a hell of a state at that point and had a lot of work done to it. It's a fascinating building, though. It's still shut, unfortunately, I believe, because of the aftermath of COVID. But because it's been shut for so long, there is some structural concerns about the inside. It's got a massive archway when you go in. It's got this horrendous crack in the middle, which people have been assured isn't going to fall down. But it looks like it will, but it probably won't. But I think they're just being cautious. If you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, health and safety takes over, unfortunately. Yeah. So is there any indication then of what this very short man in a suit, who it could be?
We have no idea, absolutely no idea, unless it was a council worker from the time. I mean, bizarrely enough, in there just now, today, there is a room that was kind of like an add-on, if you like, a later add-on. It's got a number of civic portraits from ex-Lord Provosts, etc. I mean, he's definitely not a Lord Provost because, he didn't look like any of those, but he could be somebody connected to that period of time. So these portraits date from the 1920s, 30s and 40s. So he looks like he's someone from there, but who he is, I have absolutely no idea. But apparently he's been seen a few times. But certainly Mary said he was completely and utterly solid, which was very, very bizarre. It's a strange old place there, I have to say. I mean, I worked there for years, and typically in a building, you can go in 100 times and see nothing or feel nothing, but it's always that one occasion. They also used to open up for visiting sort of like ghost hunt events, and I used to have to go on and be there just as a kind of extra pair of hands because I was a council employee, which was interesting watching groups at work, but typically nothing happened because I always think sometimes when you go on these big sort of ghost investigations with a huge mob, things tend not to happen. It's always when there's a slightly sort of quieter approach seems to get better results, I've found.
Yeah, I'm always quite sceptical of these types of organised, ghost hunts. especially the ones that charge money for for the privilege, because as you probably well know, this sort of phenomena doesn't perform to order, does it? It's gonna do what it wants to do when it wants to do it, and it's not going to perform just because there's a big group of paying customers, shall we say, who are being taken on a guided tour of somewhere. So yeah, that's.
It used to be. Oh, sorry. I was going
to say I'm fascinated by the 4 foot man in the suit. I think that would be quite scary, really. I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's an odd one. It's not the kind of thing that you kind of, of all the experiences people talk about. It's a pretty kind of definite character with a very vivid description.
And quite a unique one as well. Really, I don't think I've heard of anything similar. Does Aberdeen have, and again, please excuse my ignorance of the area around the city, does it have any sort of old castles or anything like that have got any particular good stories?
There's quite a lot of castles in the vicinity. The one I think nearest to us would be Crathis Castle, which is supposed to have a green lady. And there's been lots of stories about that. So I never really did any research on it, but I do remember reading that supposedly buried underneath the hearthstone at the fire, there was a female skeleton found with a baby skeleton as well. And I'm not sure what period this was, but they claim it was either a servant and baby, probably a legitimate pregnancy perhaps, or it could have been the lady of the house. I mean, that's how vague it is. There's sort of conflicting stories. But apparently this figure of a woman and baby's been seen by the fireplace on a number of occasions. But I don't know much else than that, to be honest. A lot of people talk, I think it's a National Trust building, so, it gets a wee mention usually in books, but there's never a great raft of eyewitness accounts, unfortunately. It seems to be, just sporadic, and it's kind of stuck. But yeah, she's known as the Green Lady of Crathis. And I remember going there in the 70s, and they were talking about it then, of course, and I was petrified. When I was only about 5, going to this supposedly haunted room, but of course never saw anything. But yeah, it's stuck since then for sure. So
you obviously moved away then from Aberdeen and moved to Edinburgh, as you mentioned at the beginning of our chat. I mean, what's your thoughts about how the scene is, shall we say, in Edinburgh as opposed to Aberdeen? I mean, do you find that it's a lot more touristy, for instance?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's an odd one. Because, I'm sort of doing tour guiding at the moment as a kind of job, I guess, and local people are very disparaging about it a lot of the time. You'll be standing doing a tour, and customers, tourists are there. They're fascinated by the city. It's quite a unique city, obviously. You know what it's like. It's pretty much unique in Scotland as far as the amount of preserved buildings it has. So the tourists are quite in awe of this. But the locals are kind of odd. They've got a weird attitude, they're kind of biting the hand that feeds, because obviously without tourism, which is a massive injection of money to the city, things might be in dire straits, but they also get very angry about the streets being full of and so they'll shout abuse at you and think that everything you're saying is nonsense, like you're making everything up just to while away the hours with people. It's an odd situation. There's not a lot of respect, I don't think, for tour guides. They think we're all kind of, chancers and making this up, and it's an odd thing. They love ghosts. Everywhere you go in Edinburgh, that you've got umpteen ghost tours online. You've got all the Southbridge vaults, of course. You've got the Mary King's Close haunted graveyards, and they make a big deal of it. Aberdeen doesn't do anything really at all. There's a couple of tour companies, like Hidden Aberdeen Tours is one of the only ones I know that does or did do ghost tours occasionally. But Edinburgh, you go there and that's all you're getting. Boom, boom, boom. Now, the strange thing is that and I'm not saying this is bad, I'm not meaning to put anyone down, but a lot of these companies employ actors.
Yeah.
So they don't really have any interest in the subject, but they're there to deliver the line in
Mm.
costume, which is great, and people love that kind of thing. But for me, I like just to tell a story and let people decide what they want. But I don't add frills as such. I think the stories are good, and I believe them to be true, and there is evidence to support that. And I think if people have an interest in it, they'll buy into that. But honestly, probably 99% of people on a tour have absolutely no belief and probably very little interest in ghosts, but they turn up because they kind of feel obliged to, because that's what you do in Edinburgh. It's an odd situation.
That and drink whiskey.
That and drink whiskey. And I always say to them, the pub's still open, guys, because I always ask at the beginning, who's got a belief in ghosts? And there'll be one little shy person at the back.
Yeah.
And I know I'm doomed, you know what I mean?
Yeah. What's the name of your tour?
The tour company I work for is called City Explorers, and it's one of these free tour companies. And literally, we're just self-employed guides, and we just turn up when we get a schedule. And we can kind of create our own tour, if you like, through the different places you want to go. And there's obviously certain stories you want to hit on that are the most famous or well discussed. And it's an odd one. It's an hour and a half of we try and entertain, but keep people awake at the same time. Hopefully not too scared, but we don't have access to any of the underground stuff. That's a completely separate thing. That's a business that other companies own and buy into to get a share of that, you see.
Right. Okay. So a bit like a paranormal timeshare.
Yeah. It is. One guy apparently, I think, owns probably most of the Southbridge vaults. I think he bought it up, if you like.
Okay.
So it's kind of sublet to different groups from that.
Sounds like a good business model to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a real cash cow, as you can imagine. It's
can imagine, yeah.
the money just flows in.
So your tour. Let's get back to your tour then. Have you got any good things you could tell us about some of the places you visit on your tour, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I take them down to a couple of places. Obviously, we go to Greyfriars Cemetery, which I'm sure you're well aware of. It's known as Europe's most haunted cemetery, and of course, there's all sorts of grim stories attached to it. Probably one of the most horrible ones, I guess, is the old one that happened in 2004, if I remember correctly, when there was two young lads who were drunk, and they actually broke into a big monument there called the Mackenzie tomb, and they were caught with a severed head. I don't know if you'd heard that story.
No, I haven't actually. No.
It was a court case, actually. Yeah, it was horrible.
Go on.
They actually broke in, kind of like a dare, I guess.
Yeah.
And there was loads of people around, as you can imagine, because it was very, very busy. And they disappeared for a little while. And of course, they'd all been drinking. So apparently later on they emerged, and one of them had a blue blanket under his jacket, and he'd gone into this crypt, which contains, I think, about 24 coffins under the ground, and had cut the head off of a corpse. And took it out and presented it to one of the girls in full view of a passing tour. And it wasn't a skeletal head either. It was a sort of mummified head, which caused a massive furore, of course.
Yeah.
And the guide who's leading the group had to rugby tackle him to the ground, and police were called, etc. Anyway, they missed prison by a fraction. They were fined for the desecration of a sepulchre, which I think the last persons that had ever been done for that were like body snatchers, 200 years before. But anyway, after that, this poltergeist activity allegedly increased somewhat. So there's a suggestion that whoever the head is, we think it might be Mackenzie, George Mackenzie. He was a lawyer, might be his head. That's the poltergeist. He's been angry because of the desecration, and this activity's carried on since then. But nobody really knows. It was just a really horrible story,
Yeah. So what sort of poltergeist activities been going on then? Have you any idea?
Yeah, the main thing is scratching, biting, and shoving that happens to tourists at various random times. during the day, but also at night. If you go on this particular tour, you get taken into a gated area, and you have to go on this particular tour to get in because they're the sole key holder. And if you go in there, there's been numerous reports of people actually having bad attacks on the tour and feeling pain of some description, of being punched or shoved. But more often than not, most people leave, and the cut or bruise manifests itself later. It can be quite extreme.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, my wife was filming me outside the gate of the very same area last June. I think it was the first lockdown had finished before we went back into the second lockdown, if I can remember correctly. And she's filming me at the gates of this area, which they call the Covenanters Prison, which is the haunted area. And something grabbed her on the shoulder in broad daylight. I mean, a forceful grab, and she screamed very loudly and ran behind me. And we were just, well, actually, it was about the first time I'd actually properly panicked. So I thought, my God, this is the real deal here. It never happened again, thankfully, but it was a real forceful grab on her shoulder. And my friend actually was there with his dog, and he saw this and came over and said, "What happened?" We assumed she'd been, stung by a wasp or something at the time.
Yeah.
That was odd. This is a phenomenon that just continues to this day. One of my friends actually is a guide there, a Spanish guide, and a couple of his friends, Maria and Andrea, were down in the same cemetery early one morning, and admittedly drinking. He did say, "Yeah, we've been drinking, but not excessively." And one of the girls, Maria, had wandered off, and of course they got worried because she never reappeared. So they went and had a little look around the cemetery, which is a fairly fair size, and still couldn't find her. So they went outside the gate and found her very upset, crying in a doorway. And she refused to go back in, and they sort of grilled her and said, "Well, what happened?" And she said she decided to go for a walk, and she'd seen a small girl in the white dress wandering along amongst the tombstones in classic tradition, and actually followed her. And the girl just walked through a headstone and vanished. And she said that was her right out of the graveyard, hugely upset. So there's different kind of spirits being seen there, if you like.
Yeah, that's quite. That would upset you somewhat, wouldn't it, if you saw that? Yeah. Especially if, I mean, did she believe in ghosts, or was she a non-believer, or do you not know?
I don't know if she did, but he said to me that in Spain, he's from a small village in Spain, they don't have the same attitudes we have to graveyards, because he said, I know here that everybody's quite scared or worried about graveyards at night, finding creepy. He said in Spain, we kind of use them as almost like recreational parks, and we'll go down to a graveyard at night and sit there and play a guitar, not think anything of it.
Yeah.
In Britain, we'd probably be, erring on the side of caution.
That's probably an understatement. Yeah. That's very strange. I've not heard that before, actually, about the Spanish.
And one of the other things that was peculiar, and again it happened to him, was he was out one early morning with some friends, and of course he was talking to them about the haunted area at the back and this Mackenzie poltergeist, and he's lying there on the grass chatting, and something actually landed beside him, and when he shone his phone down, it was a bird that had been cut in half.
Oh, wow.
He said it was very random and strange.
Yeah.
And they just got up and left, of course. But again, it's just a weird coincidence. And
yeah,
come from,
Yeah, I was going to say again that is just too specific an occurrence to be just a coincidence, is it? Really, it's it's not the sort of thing that you would think would just randomly happen. I mean, why would it happen at that particular time, at that particular place, in that particular way? It's coincidences they are a strange thing. Well, that's obviously one place that I will give a wide berth to for the next time I come to Edinburgh, because it sounds absolutely terrifying. Are there any famous people buried in there that you know of? Just as an aside.
There's George Jameson, but he's famous for being Scotland's premier or first portrait painter. This guy painted Charles Charles II's portrait. There's Greyfriars Bobby, of course.
Yeah.
The little dog. There's also William McGonagall, of course, who's the namesake of Professor McGonagall, but he's known as Scotland's worst poet. He's buried there. There's a few other people. I think there's some I think it's a few famous like lawyers and philosophers and possibly the odd scientist, but nobody that's a real kind of name, if you like.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a whole board of names, and they're all kind of very well-to-do citizens at the front. But the strange thing about the cemetery is they reckon it's got over 200,000 burials, but it's only got around, I think, about 300 monuments because the burials are layered up over 500 years.
Yeah.
Just on top of each other, and they're peculiarly buried literally about a foot under the ground at certain points, and teeth continually pop up out of the ground because of the rain and the weather and the people walking on it. And that's true. And I've seen a tray of teeth. They actually get collected and reburied. It's very odd.
That is quite bizarre, isn't it? And I suppose there will be a lot of unmarked graves as well.
Yeah, most are literally just paupers' graves, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. Really interesting, that. Okay, so where else do you go on your tour then?
Well, we go to a place called the Witchery, which is a hotel near the castle, and the Witchery is famous, I guess, for being built on the site where most of the witch burnings in Edinburgh took place in the 1590s. So it's got a weird reputation. Now, they own two buildings facing each other, and they're both very nice luxury hotels now. I think they both belonged to the Church of Scotland once upon a time. They're probably over 500 years old. They're very interesting buildings. We actually stayed in the second building, the smaller of the two. Me and my wife, when we got married at the castle 2013. So we stayed in this building, and it was fairly creepy, I guess. It was a few different rooms, it's stone floors, 4-poster beds, that kind of thing. But the thing was, on the first night, the wedding night, obviously we didn't see any ghosts or anything, but we were about to leave the next day, and we got a surprise from our friends. They'd booked us in for a second night as a surprise. So we were delighted, of course. And the second night was just weird. Second night was one of those nights where you kind of feel a bit kind of freaked out. There's that. I get hair going up the back of my neck if I feel something peculiar. My wife's a spiritual healer. She's quite sensitive to, buildings where they've got strange vibes, if you like. Yeah. And so we both felt very uneasy. She went to bed. I stayed up. We put all the lights on because I was actually getting a bit nervous, to be honest. And I went to make tea early in the morning, and you have to go through this corridor to the slidey door. Behind the panel's a very modern kitchen, of course. Came back to the bedroom. I'm standing at the door, and I could hear something in the corridor behind me. So I just stood and watched, and it's a very narrow corridor. And this scratching got louder, and I'm not making this up, by the way, but a dog appeared in front of my eyes, and it was a great big Irish wolfhound, and it was completely solid, and it was just literally there. It ran towards me, and I'm talking about literally 2 seconds, and it was gone again. And I just almost had a heart attack. I was up against the door. The tea was all over the floor. Yeah. You name it. I ended up back in the bedroom super quick. Now, Carol was sleeping, so I just dove under the covers and tried and tested fashion. And I lay there till morning. So I woke up in the morning and told her, and she says, "Oh my God, I woke up in the middle of the night. There was a guy walking up and down at the foot of the bed who she thought initially was me. And so she realised I was still sleeping beside her. So, of course, we had to ask the guy, was it haunted the next morning? And he just blurted out this whole list of stories concerning monks being seen in the bathroom and beds being unmade by, invisible hands and you name it. So it kind of verified what we'd thought we'd seen. He said it was very, very haunted. Most staff had some experiences. But the weirdest thing was that I think about 3 years later, I did a tour for an Airbnb guest. This was a lady from the US who was a medium. And this is true. The first thing she said about the building when I told her about the dog was it was attracted there because of a hat that was in the bedroom that belonged to its owner while he was alive. And it was the middle hat of 3, and it sat in a cabinet at the foot of the bed. And I was standing there, my jaw hitting the deck, because I can assure you, in the bedroom, there's a cabinet with 3 hats in it. And it was the middle hat that I actually picked up on my wedding night and was looking at. Wow. That was very, very odd.
Yeah, that's very strange, isn't it? Yeah,
it was a solid dog as well. I mean, it wasn't there long, but I actually thought a dog had just come into the room. And it was that moment of kind of bewilderment. Am I actually seeing this? You know what I mean? And I was
Yeah, of
kind of
course.
baffled.
Yeah,
Very odd.
yeah. And what's the name of that hotel?
It's called the Witchery.
Okay.
If you Google it, it's got, I think, about 11 suites, and they're all themed. There's one called the Armory Suite. That's the one we stayed in, which has got kind of military uniforms and hats and such like. And there's one called the Secret Library. Obviously, it's all books. And there's one called the Vestry, that's sort of religious paraphernalia. And they're really, really interesting building. I mean, the building's interesting alone, but they're filled with antiques and just curios. And it's a bit of an experience to stay there, as you can imagine.
I can imagine. Yeah, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
It's just going through my mind. It's my wife's birthday soon, so
Yeah.
maybe
No.
maybe it'll be all booked up. But no,
Yes,
I'll
it is a really cool place.
yeah.
Strangely, the Witchery was actually created as Witchery Tours. It was a ghost tour company originally, and the guy was such a success that he opened a restaurant. He actually bought the building because they started the tours literally outside the restaurant. It was a kind of mixed match of the two, and it used to be a kind of gimmicky restaurant where they'd have a waxwork of a witch sitting inside it initially. But over the years, it's become, more sophisticated, if you like, and they've got rid of all the kind of Halloweeny stuff, and it's just like a really nice, romantic kind of restaurant now. But that's what they started off with, and they had some weird phenomena take place. I remember reading an article. They did a séance one night. They had these kind of fun evenings when the public would come along and pay to come and sit a meal, have a meal, and a medium would come in and do a little bit, and it would just be a sort of fun, spooky evening. But anyway, they did a sort of pretend séance a few years back, and apparently something really dreadful happened, which he would not talk about, and they never did it again after that because they attracted a very negative entity.
Right. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Must have been quite scary if they won't talk about it.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I remember reading the article in the paper, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. But I've not been able to find any more than that, other than they discontinued these events because of what happened.
So what's the history then of witch trials in Edinburgh? Do you know
Yeah,
or
I know a wee bit. It was like, King James I had written a book. I remember a book called Demonology,
yeah.
and he really believed, that witchcraft and witch covens were a real force to be reckoned with. The one thing he was obsessed about was witches and the fact they were out to get him, because I believe his wife had been travelling over from Holland, I think, or prior to the wedding.
Yeah.
And a massive storm came up, and I think the boat was almost wrecked. And of course, he
That's right. Yeah.
perceived it to be the Berwick witches, if I remember.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've done a bit of research into that myself, actually. So yeah, you're right. It was his wife came over and they were hit by a massive storm and the boat nearly sank.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, it was down to James the First of England as he became obviously James Sixth of Scotland.
It's Scotland, yeah.
That the Pendle witch trials happened because of his attitude, towards rooting out witches. So yeah, that's quite an interesting tie in that. Yeah. So sorry, go on. I interrupted you, Graeme.
No, it is a fascinating story. I mean, it's unfortunate, as you know. I mean, you'll be well versed in this. How one man's opinion could probably sway the whole country in a sense, and people were accusing neighbours of all sorts, and some really horrible, sad stories when you read about it. And it's horrible, really. There's talk of them erecting a proper monument to the witches, the people, the innocent people who died. So there's a lot of talk about this at the moment, but there's a really quite a horrible, quite scary story attached to that, to witchcraft, which is based around Holyrood Palace, of course, which is sort of the other end of the Royal Mile from the castle. Of course, that's the building that the current Queen has a wee holiday in now and then when she's up in Scotland. She'll stay over at Holyrood. But there is a witch that was held near there or next to it called Agnes. They called her Agnes Sampson, I think. So they referred to her as Bald Agnes because her head was shaven before her execution. And she was just this poor woman, typically who kind of admitted to witchcraft, probably under torture, of course, and ended up being burned at the stake. But our ghost's been seen a couple of times in the palace, and both times, from what I've heard, sounds incredibly frightening, actually. There was a poor guy in there, an electrician, probably about 20 years ago, was called in to repair a plug in the wall, and he was on this corridor on his own. It was a narrow little corridor away from the public eye. And he hears a noise, and he looks around. There's a woman wearing what he describes as a white shroud shuffling towards him. And of course, he just bolted. Absolutely terrifying. And another guy, I think around about the same time, was a young German diplomat, and they were having some kind of Commonwealth meeting, if I remember correctly. And this guy was along basically to take notes, I guess. And they'd assigned each delegate a room. They've got a kind of area, I guess, which is all like more like offices rather than these palatial rooms. And the guy went in to collect his papers before the meeting and was heard to scream the place down and fall out of the door, almost in a state of collapse. And when he recovered, he said he walked into the room and there was a naked woman floating above the desk with no hair.
Wow.
Which sounds absolutely terrifying.
It does, absolutely. And, and somewhat jaw-dropping, I would have thought.
Yeah. And I think he did get a hell of a scare, because what I read anyway was he was actually in a state of collapse. So he must have been in real shock. So there has been the odd sighting of witches. But, I guess considering the sheer volume of people that met their end that way, it's not the most common spirit, if you like, to see in this city, funnily enough. Very few stories connected to that.
Yeah, I believe that the poor people who were tried and convicted of witchcraft, and there was it something like about 4,000 or something like that, haven't they all just received a pardon through the Scottish Parliament? So I would have thought that some sort of monument would be a fitting testimony really to it. I know it's something that they've done here, close to where I live, actually, because I do live quite close to Pendle Hill myself.
Oh, right.
And there's actually a monument to one of the Pendle witches here, which is quite poignant. When you drive past and see it every time. It's like a bronze, life-size statue of one of the women. So I think that will be quite poignant, really. Sounds brilliant. It really does. I think I was going to say, I think I'll have to, next time I'm up in Edinburgh, I will have to go on a ghost tour, but I think I'm going to have to pick yours, and because yours sounds about the most convincing of them all, rather than.
If you're ever up in Edinburgh, Craig, email me and I'll give you a private tour. How's that?
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. That will be absolutely fantastic.
No problem. I know you'll like it. I could show you more places than I would normally take. The tourists. We could have got a wee bit off the beaten track, because there's some fabulous stories here. And they all, of course, everybody tends to stick to the old Royal Mile just simply because of the time factor. But honestly, there's some fabulous stories dotted around, and some very, very odd ones as well, as you can imagine. So yeah, I'm sure you'd enjoy it.
I'm sure I would, absolutely, and I think I'll have to have you on again at some point in the very near future, and you can tell us some more, some of the lesser known ones in Edinburgh, shall we say then?
Oh yeah, absolutely, no problem.
Rather than the more well known ones, but it's been absolutely fascinating. It's been brilliant. I've absolutely loved those stories. Some of them are really really quite hair raising, aren't they? Even just to listen to them, let alone be unfortunate enough to actually see these things. So it's brilliant. Where can people find your work then, Graeme? Find your books and that?
I've got books. I've got the book I've got out at the moment, The Aberdeen's Haunted Heritage, can be gotten through eBay, or can be gotten through Amazon. Or if people want to contact me directly, I could give you my email number, I guess. Was that kind of okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course, absolutely, yeah.
So it would be Graeme with an AEME, graeme.m@live.co.uk. And if people are interested, they can email me and I can sign them books or dedicate them or whatever they want. But Amazon's the other place if you just want to go straight for that. They've got a wee stock in at the moment. And like the eBay also have them in. And the Ghost Tour, The Confessions of an Edinburgh Ghost Tour Guide, which is the very long-winded title of my latest one, which is just finished, should hopefully be out. I'm hoping for the end of June. It's still at the stage of trying to work out the the cover design. I'm going for something a little different this time. But I'm hoping, literally within a few months that one will be out, because I'm really quite proud of it. I've really enjoyed it, and it's a mixture of really scary but also quite funny. I'm quite sarcastic in my delivery, I have to say. But there's some fabulous ghost stories there as well, and I try and I've added new ones, I think, to the Edinburgh palette. So for those that are well au fait with the city, might be surprised and might discover some gems amongst them. But yeah, it was good. It was good fun.
Well, that's definitely a title I'm going to keep my eye open for. Then I'd love to read that. It sounds brilliant. It's been great to have you on, Graeme. I've really enjoyed this chat we've had. And like I said, I'd love to have you back on again sometime in the near future. I'm sure we'll keep in touch. And thank you very much for coming on today.
No problem, Craig. Thanks for having me. I've very much enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure's been all ours. Thank you very much.
All the best, mate.
And you. Thank you.
You can visit my website at www.craigbryant.co.uk. Paranormal Pendle will return, and remember to keep watching the shadows.